Chapter 1 Mutation The Fear of Being Born. Different. With this moment, the story begins with the first X-Men film released in 2000, a world where mutation is not yet a legend or a war, but a quiet, growing fear beneath everyday life. Mutation enters the world of the X-Men not as a spectacle, but as a quiet disruption, something that exists beneath the surface of everyday life long before it is named, categorized, or feared. And from the very beginning of the saga, it is clear that being born different is not portrayed as a gift, but as a sentence handed down without explanation. The opening moments of the story place us in a world that looks familiar, safe, orderly, a world that believes it understands itself, and yet beneath that order lies an unspoken anxiety, the fear that humanity is no longer alone in defining what it means to be human. Mutation is not the result of ambition, technology, or choice. It is random, biological, inevitable, and that randomness is precisely what makes it terrifying. There is no enemy to fight, no invasion to repel, no moral failing to correct. Mutation simply happens, and in happening, it challenges the illusion that normality is stable or permanent. Children are born with abilities they did not ask for, powers that manifest during moments of stress, puberty, or trauma, turning their own bodies into sources of danger and alienation. Society responds not with curiosity, but with suspicion, because difference, when it cannot be controlled, is perceived as a threat. The film frames mutation through the lens of history repeating itself. Fear of the other is not new, it merely adapts. Where once the world feared race, religion, or ideology, it now fears genetic deviation. The language used to discuss mutants mirrors the language of discrimination, registration, containment, cure, control. Mutants are spoken about as problems to be solved rather than people to be understood. This framing is deliberate because the story of the X-Men is not about superheroes rising to fame, but about marginalized individuals trying to exist in a world that would prefer they did not. Mutation becomes a metaphor for every identity that has ever been labeled dangerous simply for existing. The public reaction to mutation unfolds slowly. There is no immediate war, no mass hysteria. Instead, there is debate, legislation, news broadcasts, whispered conversations, and political posturing. Fear spreads not through violence at first, but through policy and rhetoric. This subtlety makes it more unsettling. The world does not need monsters to justify its anxiety. It needs only uncertainty. Mutants destabilize the social contract by proving that equality is fragile when power is unevenly distributed. If some are born stronger, faster, more capable, what does fairness mean? The question lingers unanswered, and in that silence fear takes root. Mutation also isolates those who experience it. For many mutants, their powers emerge as accidents, moments of loss of control that result in injury, destruction, or exposure. These moments are often deeply personal and deeply traumatic. A young person realizing they can harm others without intending to carries a guilt that cannot be explained away. Mutation turns adolescence, already a period of confusion and vulnerability, into a minefield where emotions have consequences far beyond embarrassment or rebellion. The body becomes something to distrust, something that might betray you at any moment. This internal fear mirrors the external one, creating a cycle where mutants fear themselves almost as much as the world fears them. The film makes it clear that mutation does not come with instruction. There is no guidebook, no universal rule. Each mutant must navigate their abilities alone unless they find community. And community itself becomes dangerous in a world that equates gathering with conspiracy. Isolation is not just a consequence of fear, it is one of its tools. When mutants are separated from one another, they are easier to misunderstand, easier to control, easier to erase. The world does not need to hunt them aggressively if it can simply convince them to hide. Mutation also forces humanity to confront a deeply uncomfortable idea that evolution is indifferent to comfort. The emergence of mutants suggests that humanity is changing, whether it wants to or not. This challenges the belief that humans are the final, perfected version of themselves. Evolution continuing implies obsolescence, and obsolescence is terrifying. The fear is not just that mutants exist, but that they represent a future where baseline humanity is no longer dominant. This existential threat fuels much of the hostility toward mutants, even when that hostility is dressed up as concern for safety. What makes the fear of mutation especially tragic is that it is often justified through imagined worst-case scenarios. Mutants are judged not by who they are, but by what they might become. Potential replaces reality. A child with a harmless ability is treated as though they are one step away from catastrophe. This preemptive judgment strips mutants of individuality, reducing them to risk assessments rather than people. It is easier to fear a category than a person, and the world quickly learns to do exactly that. The opening chapter of the X-Men saga establishes mutation not as a problem to be solved, but as a reality to be lived with. It asks whether society is capable of adapting ethically to biological change, or whether fear will always outpace empathy. Mutation itself is neutral. It does not choose sides. It does not demand domination or harmony. Those demands come from humans reacting to what they do not understand. And in that reaction, the true conflict of the saga is born. The fear of being born different is not loud. It does not always scream or riot. Often, it whispers through laws, stares, silence, and rejection. And it is within that quiet fear that the world of the X-Men begins, not with heroes flying through the sky, but with a question humanity has never fully answered. What do we do when the future looks nothing like us? Chapter 2: Charles Xavier, A Dream of Coexistence. Charles Xavier enters the story not as a warrior or a symbol of power, but as an idea made human, a man who believes that fear can be answered with understanding and that difference does not have to end in domination, even in a world that has given him every reason to think otherwise. Xavier's dream of coexistence is not naive optimism. It is a deliberate response to a history that has shown him what happens when fear is allowed to dictate policy and identity. From the beginning, Xavier understands that mutants will never be accepted by proving they are harmless, because fear does not respond to reassurance, it responds to familiarity. His school is not merely a sanctuary, it is an experiment, a controlled environment where young mutants can learn not just how to use their abilities, but how to exist without apology. Xavier believes that power, when understood, becomes less frightening, and that secrecy, while tempting, only reinforces the myth that mutants have something to hide. Xavier's philosophy is shaped by restraint. Despite possessing one of the most invasive powers imaginable, the ability to enter minds and reshape perception, he chooses limitation as a moral stance. He does not deny the potential for abuse, he acknowledges it and builds his entire identity around refusing to cross that line. In doing so, he sets a standard not just for himself, but for every mutant who looks to him for guidance. His dream is not one of superiority or dominance, but of shared space, a world where mutants and humans exist side by side, without one needing to erase the other. This belief places him in direct contrast with the prevailing instincts of the world around him, which sees power as something that must either be controlled or eliminated. The school itself becomes the physical manifestation of Xavier's dream. Hidden in plain sight, it operates as both refuge and classroom, a place where mutants are allowed to be whole rather than fragmented by fear. Xavier understands that the first battle is internal. Before mutants can face a hostile world, they must stop fearing themselves. Training in this context is not about combat readiness, but self-trust. He teaches discipline not to prepare students for war, but to prevent accidents born of panic. Each lesson is an attempt to replace shame with competence, secrecy with understanding. Xavier's approach recognizes that uncontrolled power is dangerous, not because it is evil, but because it is afraid. Xavier's optimism is often misunderstood as denial of reality, but it is, in fact, an acceptance of risk. He knows his dream may fail. He knows humans may never fully trust mutants. He knows that one mistake could undo years of quiet progress. Yet he persists because the alternative, preemptive conflict would guarantee the very outcome he fears. Xavier's refusal to abandon hope is not rooted in ignorance of history, but in his determination not to repeat it. He has seen what happens when groups define themselves by opposition alone. Coexistence to him is not passive acceptance, it is active engagement, a constant effort to bridge a gap that fear keeps widening. His leadership style reflects this philosophy. Xavier does not rule through intimidation or force. He persuades, guides, and sometimes manipulates, not to control, but to protect the fragile balance he is trying to build. This moral ambiguity complicates his character. Xavier is willing to make difficult choices, to withhold information, to act unilaterally when he believes the outcome justifies the means. These decisions reveal the tension at the heart of his dream. Coexistence requires trust, but maintaining it in a fearful world often requires secrecy. Xavier walks this line carefully, aware that each compromise risks undermining the very principles he stands for. Xavier's relationship with the world outside the school is defined by patience. He engages with governments cautiously, understanding that institutions move slowly and that fear-driven policies can harden overnight. He does not seek to overthrow systems or expose mutants forcibly. He believes that acceptance imposed is not acceptance at all. This incremental approach frustrates those who want immediate change, but Xavier views time as an ally. He trusts that exposure, dialogue, and example will gradually erode prejudice. Whether this trust is wisdom or stubbornness remains an open question, and the story never offers an easy answer. At the core of Xavier's dream is empathy, not as sentiment, but as strategy. He believes that if humans can see mutants not as threats, but as people, fear will lose its grip. This belief is constantly tested by events that suggest the opposite, by acts of violence that reinforce stereotypes, by political forces eager to exploit fear for control. Yet, Xavier does not abandon his vision. He adapts, recalibrates, and continues because, for him, coexistence is not a destination, but a practice, something that must be chosen repeatedly, even when it seems futile. Charles Xavier's dream is fragile precisely because it is human. It relies on trust, patience, and restraint in a world that rewards decisiveness and force. But it is this fragility that gives it weight. The X-Men do not begin as soldiers marching toward victory. They begin as students learning how not to be feared. And, in that quiet, determined effort to coexist, Xavier offers the saga its central question. Is survival enough, or must it also include understanding? Chapter 3: Eric Laneshare's A Childhood Forged in Hatred. Eric Laneshare's story begins long before mutation is debated on television screens or feared in quiet neighborhoods, beginning instead in a place where difference was already a death sentence, a place where identity alone was enough to justify cruelty, and where the lesson learned was not subtle but absolute. The world will hurt you if it can. Eric's childhood is defined by separation, by the violent removal of safety, family, and innocence in a moment that imprints itself so deeply that it becomes the foundation of everything he will later believe. In the concentration camp, fear is not theoretical and survival is not heroic. It is accidental, arbitrary, and often meaningless. When Eric's powers first manifest, tearing metal from the earth in a desperate attempt to reach his mother, it is not a moment of triumph, but of irreversible loss. Power arrives too late to save what mattered most, and that timing shapes Eric forever. Mutation, for him, is not wonder or evolution. It is proof that the world only responds to strength, and even then, not always in time. The trauma of that moment does not fade, it crystallizes. Eric does not grow up believing that humanity can be reasoned with, because his earliest memory of authority is one of indifference and violence. Guards follow orders, systems operate efficiently, compassion is absent. These lessons become Eric's worldview, not as bitterness, but as preparation. He learns that safety does not come from acceptance, but from dominance. That lesson follows him into adulthood, shaping every choice he makes and every alliance he forms. Where Xavier believes fear can be dissolved through understanding, Eric believes fear must be redirected. If the world insists on fearing mutants, then it should fear them correctly. Eric's relationship with power is inseparable from loss. Unlike mutants who discover their abilities gradually, Eric's power is born in agony, and it never stops carrying that echo. Metal bends not because Eric wishes to impress, but because his emotions overwhelm containment. His control is learned through discipline and anger, not calm. Each act of mastery is an attempt to ensure that helplessness will never return. In this way, Eric's power is not a weapon he wields, it is armor he wears, heavy and unyielding, designed to keep pain out even if it keeps connection out as well. When Eric encounters Charles Xavier, the contrast is immediate and profound. Both men are powerful, intelligent, and shaped by trauma, yet their responses diverge completely. Xavier's pain leads him toward inclusion. Eric's leads him toward separation. Where Xavier sees the potential for coexistence, Eric sees inevitability of conflict. Their bond is built on mutual recognition. Each sees in the other a reflection of what they could have become under different circumstances. This makes their ideological divide deeply personal. Eric does not oppose Xavier because he misunderstands him. He opposes him because he understands him too well and believes his dream is doomed. Eric's actions throughout the story are often framed as antagonistic, yet they are driven by a protective instinct twisted by history. He does not seek chaos for its own sake. He seeks security for mutants at any cost. To Eric, compromise is surrender, and patience is a luxury afforded only to those who have not seen how quickly rights can disappear. He believes that waiting for acceptance is dangerous, because history shows that tolerance can evaporate overnight. In his mind, preemptive strength is not aggression, it is survival. The tragedy of Eric Lensher lies in the fact that his fears are not irrational. The world of the X-Men repeatedly validates his concerns, responding to mutation with suspicion, control, and violence. Each new policy, each act of hostility, reinforces his belief that Xavier's dream is a beautiful illusion. Yet, Eric's refusal to believe in coexistence becomes self-fulfilling. By acting as the threat humanity fears, he accelerates the very conflict he hopes to prevent. This cycle traps him in a role he never consciously chose but cannot abandon without betraying the child he once was. Eric's childhood trauma does not excuse his actions, but it explains their emotional logic. Hatred, in his case, is not learned, it is inherited from experience. He does not hate humanity because he enjoys cruelty. He hates humanity because he learned early that cruelty often goes unpunished. His ideology is not built on malice but on memory, and memory is a powerful motivator. Where Xavier asks mutants to trust a world that once rejected them, Eric asks them to remember what that rejection looked like. Eric Lensher is not simply Magneto, the enemy of the X-Men. He is the embodiment of a question the saga never fully resolves. When the world has already shown you its worst, is hope an act of courage or an act of denial? His childhood forged him not into a monster but into a guardian who believes the only way to protect the future is to never forget the past. Chapter 4: Wolverine, a man without a past. Logan enters the story of the X-Men not as a symbol of mutation or ideology, but as a wound that never fully closed, a man whose body heals faster than his mind can, leaving him trapped in an endless prison where pain fades but memory refuses to form. Unlike others, Wolverine does not fear being born different because he no longer remembers being born at all. His terror comes from absence, from the hollow space where identity should be, from the knowledge that something was taken and never returned. His life is defined by fragments, images, sensations, instincts that surface without context and vanish before they can be understood. Metal claws emerge not as a choice but as reflex. Violence rising before thought can intervene, suggesting a history where survival depended on reaction rather than reflection. Logan does not ask what he is, he asks what was done to him, and the lack of answers fuels a restlessness that keeps him moving, fighting, drinking, and forgetting in equal measure. Wolverine's mutation isolates him in a different way than others. His healing factor prevents death but not damage, forcing him to endure every wound fully aware that pain will arrive before recovery. This creates a relationship with violence that is intimate and relentless. He does not seek conflict, yet conflict finds him because it is the only environment where his skills make sense. Without a past to anchor him, Logan becomes a creature of instinct, guided by gut reactions rather than moral frameworks. He is neither hopeful like Xavier nor ideologically driven like Magneto. He is pragmatic, suspicious of dreams, and wary of causes. Ideology requires memory, belief in progress, or regression, and Logan has neither. He exists in the now, where survival is the only consistent objective. The absence of memory becomes both shield and curse. Logan cannot be haunted by specific traumas, but he is haunted by the certainty that they exist. Nightmares bleed into waking life, sensations echo without origin, and his body remembers what his mind cannot. The claws know how to kill, the muscles know how to fight, the rage arrives fully formed, as though trained and conditioned long ago. This disconnect creates a deep mistrust of himself. Logan fears what he might become if the truth ever resurfaces, because whatever shaped him clearly valued violence over humanity. Forgetting, in this sense, becomes an act of self-preservation. If the past is monstrous, perhaps it is safer to leave it buried. When Logan encounters the X-Men, he is drawn not to their mission, but to their structure. The school represents something he has lacked for as long as he can remember: boundaries, rules, a place where power is acknowledged and contained rather than exploited. Yet, he resists belonging. Trust requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires memory. Logan's interactions with Xavier are tense because Xavier offers insight without forcing it, a patience that unsettles someone accustomed to manipulation. Xavier does not promise answers, he offers time. For Logan, time is both ally and enemy. Every moment lived without memory is a moment of stability, yet also a reminder that something essential is missing. Wolverine's presence exposes a fundamental tension within the mutant community. He is proof that mutation does not guarantee enlightenment or moral clarity. Power can exist without purpose, strength without direction. Logan's struggle is not about acceptance by humanity, but acceptance of himself. He does not know whether he is capable of gentleness, whether kindness is a learned behavior, or something that must be remembered. His hesitation to engage emotionally reflects a fear that connection will demand truths he cannot face. If he belongs somewhere, then that place might also claim responsibility for what he is. Logan's arc in the first X-Men film is intentionally incomplete. He does not resolve his past or find peace. Instead, he confronts the reality that running from the unknown does not make it disappear. His journey is less about discovering who he was and more about choosing who he will be in the absence of that knowledge. This choice is quiet, uncelebrated, and fragile. It does not come with certainty, only intention. Logan begins to understand that identity is not solely constructed from memory, but from action, from the decisions made when no one is watching and no history is guiding the hand. Wolverine's story introduces a crucial emotional thread to the saga, the idea that not all wounds are visible and not all healing is progress. Some scars remain undefined, shaping behavior without explanation. Logan embodies the cost of violence stripped of narrative, of survival without context. He is not a symbol of mutant pride or resistance. He is a reminder that power without memory can still choose restraint, and that even a man without a past can decide what kind of future he is willing to stand for. Chapter 5: Stryker, When Fear Becomes Policy. With this moment, the story moves into X-Men 2, and the fear that once whispered at the edges of society hardens into doctrine, authority, and policy. William Stryker enters the narrative not as an anomaly, but as an escalation, the embodiment of what happens when private fear is given institutional power and moral certainty is codified into law. Where earlier anxieties about mutation lived in debate and rhetoric, Stryker transforms them into procedure, believing that protection requires preemption, and that safety is best achieved through control. His worldview is not born from ignorance of mutants, but from intimate proximity to them, a proximity that curdled into obsession rather than understanding. Stryker does not see individuals. He sees variables, risks, and outcomes, and this reduction allows him to justify actions that would otherwise be unthinkable. In his hands, fear becomes policy, and policy becomes violence that wears the language of necessity. Stryker's authority is unsettling precisely because it is legitimate. He does not operate from the shadows. He uses uniforms, commands, and systems designed to reassure the public. This legitimacy reframes the conflict. The danger is no longer a rogue extremist or a radical ideology, but the machinery of the state itself, moving efficiently toward a goal it believes is righteous. Stryker's programs are clinical, bureaucratic, and methodical, transforming mutation into a problem set to be solved through containment, experimentation, and eradication. His methods strip the conflict of drama and replace it with inevitability. When fear is institutionalized, resistance feels not only dangerous, but futile. At the core of Stryker's ideology is a refusal to accept unpredictability. He believes that uncertainty is the enemy of order, and that freedom, when paired with power, is irresponsible. Mutants, in his view, represent uncontrolled variables in an already fragile system. Rather than adapting society to accommodate difference, he seeks to eliminate difference itself. This approach is chilling not because it is new, but because it echoes historical patterns where states justified cruelty by framing it as protection. Stryker's language is careful. He speaks of security, prevention, and responsibility, avoiding words like oppression or cruelty. The harm he causes is rendered invisible through euphemism. Stryker's personal history deepens the tragedy of his role. His fear is not abstract, it is rooted in loss and perceived betrayal. Instead of processing grief, he externalizes it, projecting blame onto an entire group. This transformation from wounded individual to architect of suffering illustrates how trauma, when unexamined, can metastasize into ideology. Stryker's certainty shields him from doubt. He does not question whether his actions are just. He questions only whether they are efficient. In doing so, he relinquishes moral responsibility to outcome-based reasoning, a logic that permits any atrocity if it promises stability. The consequences of Stryker's worldview ripple outward. Xavier's school, once a quiet sanctuary, becomes a target. The idea that education and patience could foster coexistence is challenged by the realization that institutions can turn hostile overnight. Safety is revealed to be conditional, dependent on who controls the narrative of threat. For the mutants, this marks a shift from social fear to existential danger. It is no longer about being misunderstood. It is about being hunted by a system that believes itself justified. Stryker's confrontation with Xavier crystallizes the philosophical divide at the heart of the saga. Xavier believes that fear can be eased through understanding and exposure. Stryker believes that understanding merely clarifies the need for control. Where Xavier sees potential for growth, Stryker sees inevitability of conflict. This divide is not bridged by dialogue because it is not rooted in disagreement over facts, but over values. Stryker does not doubt that mutants are people. He doubts that people should be trusted with power. In this way, his ideology extends beyond mutants, revealing a broader contempt for autonomy itself. When fear becomes policy, resistance takes on a different shape. It is no longer enough to argue for acceptance. Survival requires alliances, compromises, and actions that blur moral lines. The mutants are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Restraint does not always prevent harm, and patience does not always buy safety. This realization strains Xavier's dream and validates, at least partially, Magneto's warnings. The world Stryker creates is one where choices are narrowed and neutrality becomes impossible. William Stryker is not remembered as a monster because he does not see himself as one. He is remembered as a warning. He demonstrates how quickly societies can transform fear into doctrine and how easily power can convince itself that cruelty is care. In X-Men 2, the conflict is no longer about whether mutants should be accepted, but whether a fearful world can be trusted with authority over difference at all. Chapter 6: Nightcrawler: Faith in a World That Hates You. Nightcrawler enters X-Men 2, not with confidence or defiance, but with terror, his body marked by difference so visible that it cannot be hidden, his existence a living provocation in a world already primed to fear what it does not understand. Kurt Wagner's mutation is not subtle. It announces itself in blue skin, a tail, yellow eyes, and the ability to disappear in clouds of smoke. And because of this visibility, Kurt learns early that faith is not a comfort, but a necessity. He is hunted not because of what he does, but because of what he looks like, and that distinction shapes his entire understanding of morality. In a society where appearance dictates guilt, Kurt does not turn inward toward hatred or outward toward revenge. Instead, he turns upward, clinging to belief as a way to remain human when the world insists he is not. His faith is not naive optimism, it is resistance against dehumanization. Kurt's opening's actions are framed through coercion. Controlled, manipulated, and weaponized by Stryker, he becomes an instrument of terror without consent, forced to violate his own moral code in service of someone else's fear. This violation is deeply personal. Kurt believes that faith requires choice, and when that choice is removed, violence becomes not just an act, but a wound to the soul. His teleportation, once a means of escape, is transformed into a tool of intrusion, forcing him into spaces where he does not belong, against people he does not wish to harm. When control is finally broken, Kurt does not celebrate freedom. He collapses under the weight of what he has been made to do. Guilt, for him, is immediate and overwhelming, because unlike others, he does not compartmentalize it. He feels it fully. Nightcrawler's faith distinguishes him from every other character in the film. In a narrative dominated by fear, policy, and retaliation, Kurt introduces grace. He believes in forgiveness. Not because he believes the world deserves it, but because he believes he must offer it to remain himself. This belief places him at odds with both humans who hate him and mutants who have abandoned hope of coexistence. Kurt does not deny the reality of persecution. He acknowledges it openly. His faith does not blind him to cruelty. It helps him survive it without becoming cruel in return. When Kurt finds refuge among the X-Men, the contrast is stark. The school represents safety, but safety does not erase trauma. Kurt remains wary, gentle, cautious in his movements and speech, as though expecting rejection at any moment. His visible difference makes him acutely aware of the conditional nature of acceptance. Even among mutants, he knows he is an outlier. This awareness does not breed resentment, it deepens his empathy. Kurt understands what it means to be seen only as a symbol, and he refuses to reduce others in the same way. Nightcrawler's conversations with Wolverine reveal a shared pain expressed differently. Both are defined by violence done to them, yet where Logan responds with suspicion and withdrawal, Kurt responds with openness and belief. Their dialogue is not about theology, but about choice. Kurt asks whether survival requires abandoning moral responsibility, whether the world's hatred excuses hatred in return. Logan, shaped by a loss of memory and trust, offers no easy answers. The tension between them reflects a larger question within the saga. Is faith a liability in a hostile world, or is it the only thing that prevents the world from becoming nothing but hostility? Kurt's refusal to embrace vengeance challenges Magneto's worldview as well. He understands Eric's anger, respects his pain, but rejects his conclusions. For Kurt, responding to hatred with domination ensures that hatred wins. This is not weakness, it is a strategic moral stance. Kurt believes that becoming what the world expects of you is the greatest defeat. His faith is not passive acceptance, it is active resistance against reduction to fear's expectations. Nightcrawler's presence reframes the conflict of X-Men 2. He demonstrates that difference does not require justification, that faith can coexist with fear without surrendering to it, and that moral integrity is not the absence of anger, but the refusal to let anger dictate identity. In a story where power often determines worth, Kurt's power lies in restraint. He chooses not to define himself by what he can do to others, but by what he refuses to do, even when the world insists otherwise. Faith, for Nightcrawler, is not a promise of safety or justice. It is a commitment to remain human in a world that has decided he is not. And in making that choice, again and again, he becomes one of the quiet moral centers of the X-Men saga, a reminder that belief, when rooted in compassion rather than certainty, can survive even the deepest hatred. Chapter 7: Xavier and Magneto. Two responses to the same pain. Xavier and Magneto stand opposite one another, not because they misunderstand the world, but because they understand it in exactly the same way and draw radically different conclusions from that understanding, making their conflict less a battle of good versus evil than a dialogue between two wounds that never healed in the same way. Both men are defined by trauma, experienced early and without mercy, moments that taught them how quickly safety can be stripped away, and how indifferent systems can be to individual suffering. Where their paths diverge is not in what they saw, but in what they decided that pain meant. Xavier looks at the world and sees a cycle that must be broken, believing that if fear is answered with patience and exposure, it can be unlearned over time. Magneto looks at the same world and sees inevitability, believing that history has already proven fear will always resurface and must therefore be met with strength before it can act. These are not abstract philosophies, they are survival strategies born from the same source. Their shared past gives way to every disagreement. Xavier understands Magneto's anger not as ideology, but as memory that never stopped burning. Magneto understands Xavier's hope not as ignorance, but as defiance against despair. Each sees the other as dangerously incomplete. To Magneto, Xavier's restraint invites annihilation. To Xavier, Magneto's aggression guarantees it. Their conversations are calm, often intimate because they are not trying to convince an enemy, but to save a friend from what they believe is a fatal miscalculation. This intimacy is what makes their conflict so enduring. They are not arguing over tactics, they are arguing over whether humanity is capable of change. In X-Men 2, their uneasy alliance against Stryker reveals how thin the line between their philosophies truly is. Faced with a threat that seeks to eradicate mutants entirely, Magneto and Xavier cooperate, proving that survival sometimes requires unity regardless of ideology. Yet, even in cooperation, the tension remains. Xavier views the alliance as proof that coexistence is possible, that common ground can be found even in crisis. Magneto views it as confirmation that force is the only language institutions understand. The same event reinforces opposing beliefs, deepening the divide rather than closing it. Xavier's use of his powers reflects his commitment to restraint, but also exposes its limits. His willingness to invade minds when necessary reveals the contradiction at the heart of his philosophy. Protecting autonomy sometimes requires violating it. Magneto seizes on this contradiction as evidence that moral purity is an illusion. To him, power is power, regardless of how gently it is applied. Xavier's discomfort with this reality does not make it go away, it only makes him carry it silently. This silent burden is part of what Magneto fears most, that Xavier will break under the weight of ideals the world refuses to honor. Magneto, for his part, is not blind to the cost of his approach. He understands that choosing domination over dialogue risks turning mutants into what humanity already fears. Yet he believes that fear is unavoidable, and that embracing it strategically is safer than denying it. His philosophy is shaped by the knowledge that victims rarely get a second chance. Where Xavier believes time is an ally, Magneto believes time is the enemy, eroding safety until only force remains. This difference in how they perceive time defines their every decision. Their relationship encapsulates the central tension of the X-Men saga, whether progress is achieved through patience or pressure, through empathy or enforcement. The story refuses to declare a definitive answer because history itself has not provided one. Xavier and Magneto are not opposing poles of morality. They are responses to the same pain expressed through different instincts. The tragedy is not that they disagree, but that both may be partially right and fatally incomplete. In X-Men 2, their bond is tested but not broken, revealing that even in opposition, they recognize something essential in one another. They are mirrors reflecting alternate futures for the same past. And as the world grows more hostile, the question their relationship poses becomes more urgent. When fear is justified by experience, is hope still a virtue, or merely a risk one cannot afford to take? Chapter 8: The Mansion Attack. Safety is an illusion. The attack on Xavier's mansion arrives without warning, not as a dramatic escalation, but as a cold confirmation of everything the story has been quietly suggesting. That safety, once believed secure, is always provisional, dependent on who is watching and who decides to stop. The mansion, long presented as a sanctuary, a place of learning and calm, is revealed in this moment to be fragile. Its walls symbolic rather than absolute, and the illusion it provided shatters the instant authority turns hostile. When Stryker's forces move in, they do not face an army of seasoned warriors. They face sleeping children, students who believe that hiding in plain sight might be enough. This is what makes the moment so unsettling. Violence does not erupt because the X-Men provoked it, but because fear has reached a point where preemption feels justified. The attack is not framed as a battle, it is framed as a violation. For the young mutants inside, the mansion represented the first place where they were not defined by what they might do, but by who they were becoming. It was a space where mistakes were part of learning rather than proof of danger. The invasion collapses that distinction instantly. Fear becomes embodied in boots, weapons, and commands, transforming childhood bedrooms into escape routes and classrooms into battlegrounds. The children are not targeted for wrongdoing, they are targeted for potential, and that potential is treated as an unforgivable risk. In this moment, the story abandons any lingering comfort that restraint alone can guarantee safety. The world has decided that even hidden difference is unacceptable. Wolverine's response to the attack underscores the emotional weight of the moment. He does not fight as a hero defending a cause. He fights as a guardian protecting children who have no other shield. His violence is stripped of spectacle and reframed as necessity, every movement driven by urgency rather than ideology. Logan does not lecture or inspire, he evacuates, absorbs damage, and keeps moving. His actions communicate a harsh truth the saga has been building toward. When fear is institutionalized, survival sometimes requires force, even for those who wish it did not. The mansion attack forces Wolverine into a role he never sought but cannot refuse. The attack also exposes the limits of Xavier's dream. Coexistence, while morally compelling, proves vulnerable when confronted by power that does not share its values. Xavier is absent, captured, and rendered unable to protect the very people his vision was meant to safeguard. This absence is not framed as failure of character, but as failure of assumption, the assumption that goodwill and discretion would buy time. The mansion's fall is not a rejection of Xavier's ideals, but a demonstration that ideals require defense when fear escalates into action. For Magneto, the attack validates long-held suspicions. It confirms his belief that waiting invites annihilation, that secrecy is temporary, and that institutions will always prioritize control over coexistence when threatened. Yet, even Magneto cannot ignore the cost. The sight of children fleeing armed forces does not bring satisfaction, it brings recognition. This is the future he warned about, and seeing it realized does not bring relief, only grim resolve. The attack does not harden Magneto, it clarifies him. The psychological impact of the mansion attack lingers beyond the physical damage. Trust is fractured. The students learn that protection is conditional and that hiding does not equate to safety. Innocence, once lost, cannot be restored by rebuilding walls or reinforcing security. The mansion can be repaired, but the belief it represented cannot. The attack imprints a new understanding. Safety is not a place, it is a moment, and moments can be taken away. In X-Men 2, this event marks a turning point where the conflict moves from ideological debate to lived consequence. The question is no longer whether humans fear mutants, but what they are willing to do with that fear. The mansion attack answers with chilling clarity. It shows that when fear is given authority, no space remains neutral, and no sanctuary remains untouched. Safety, the story reveals, was never guaranteed. It was only ever borrowed. Chapter 9. The Cure. When identity becomes a choice. With this moment, the story moves into X-Men, The Last Stand, and the conflict shifts from fear imposed by force to fear disguised as freedom, as the world presents a solution that promises peace while quietly redefining what it means to exist. The announcement of a cure for mutation enters the narrative with unsettling calm, framed not as an act of aggression, but as an offer, a medical breakthrough presented in the language of compassion and choice, and it is precisely this framing that makes it so dangerous. For the first time, mutants are told they do not have to be what they are. Their difference is no longer treated solely as a threat to be controlled, but as a condition to be corrected, and the moral weight of that shift is immense. The cure does not arrive with soldiers or weapons. It arrives with press conferences, pharmaceuticals, and reassurance, asking mutants to consider whether identity itself is something that should be optional. The idea of choice becomes the central tension of this chapter. On the surface, the cure appears humane. It promises safety, normalcy, relief from fear, and an end to persecution. But beneath this promise lies an unspoken implication that mutation is a mistake. Choice, when offered in a context shaped by fear and discrimination, is never neutral. For mutants who have spent their lives being hunted, registered, or hidden, the cure is not simply an option, it is pressure disguised as freedom. Accepting it means safety, refusing it means continued danger. In such a world, choice becomes coercion, wearing a gentle face. The response within the mutant community fractures along deeply personal lines. Some see the cure as liberation, a chance to live without fear, to raise families without secrecy, to exist without apology. For those whose powers cause pain or isolation, the offer feels merciful. Others experience it as erasure, an attempt to remove what makes them who they are in order to make the world more comfortable. For them, mutation is not a disease to be cured, but a truth to be lived. The cure forces a confrontation with identity itself, asking whether selfhood is defined by genetics, experience, or acceptance. Xavier views the cure with cautious concern. He does not deny that suffering exists, nor does he dismiss the desire to be free from it. But he recognizes that presenting mutation as something to be fixed reinforces the very fear his dream has been trying to dismantle. If difference is something to be cured, then coexistence has already failed. Xavier worries not about individual choice, but about the precedent it sets. A world that believes identity can be medically erased is a world that may eventually decide who should be erased next. Magneto's response is immediate and absolute. To him, the cure is the final betrayal, proof that humanity will never accept mutants as equals and will instead demand conformity or disappearance. He does not see the cure as optional. He sees it as the first step toward enforced normalization. In his eyes, allowing the cure to exist is an act of surrender, one that invites future coercion. Magneto's fear is not unfounded. History has taught him that what begins as choice often ends as mandate. His rejection of the cure hardens into militancy, setting the stage for a conflict where mutants are no longer fighting for acceptance, but for the right to exist as they are. Wolverine stands uncomfortably between these positions. His healing factor has defined his life in ways both protective and isolating, and the idea of choosing normalcy carries a quiet appeal. To forget pain, to age, to die naturally, these are not trivial considerations for someone trapped in an endless present. Yet Logan understands that erasing mutation does not erase trauma. The cure cannot give him back his past or undo what was done to him. It can only change what comes next. His hesitation reflects the broader truth of the cure. It offers simplicity in a world shaped by complexity, and simplicity rarely arrives without cost. The cure also reframes the power dynamic between humans and mutants. Where once humans sought to control mutants through force, they now seek to redefine them through medicine. The violence is less visible but no less profound. By offering a way to remove mutation, society shifts responsibility onto mutants themselves. If you remain different, it becomes your fault. If you are persecuted, it is because you refuse the cure. This logic absolves the world of its fear while demanding conformity as the price of peace. As the narrative moves forward, the cure reveals itself not as a solution, but as a catalyst. It forces every character to confront what they believe identity truly is. Is it something to be preserved at all costs, or something to be negotiated for safety? The story does not offer easy answers. Instead, it exposes the fragility of choice in a world where power defines acceptable outcomes. The cure promises an end to conflict, but it does so by asking a question that has no neutral answer. If you could stop being who you are, should you? In The Last Stand, identity becomes the battleground, and the cure becomes the quiet weapon that threatens to end the mutant struggle, not with extinction, but with consented disappearance. Chapter 10: Jean Grey, Power Without Containment. Jean Grey's return to the story does not feel like a resurrection so much as a rupture, the re-emergence of something that was never fully understood, never fully integrated, and therefore never truly at rest, because the phoenix is not born from ambition or malice, but from power that was restrained for too long without consent. Jean has always been defined by potential held carefully in check, guided by Xavier's belief that control is protection, and that some forces, if left uncontained, would consume both the world and the self. For years, Jean accepted this containment as care, trusting that restraint was synonymous with safety. But when those barriers dissolve, what emerges is not a villain, but a person stripped of limits without having chosen their absence. The Phoenix is not an alternate personality, it is Jean, without filters, without suppression, without the structures that once kept her power aligned with intention. The tragedy of Jean Grey lies in the timing of her awakening. Her power surfaces fully in a world already divided, fearful, and unstable, a world that does not know how to respond to excess except with force. Jean does not seek domination or destruction. She seeks sensation, autonomy, and truth unmediated by others' expectations. The phoenix amplifies desire as much as it amplifies strength, eroding the distinction between want and need. In this state, Jean's emotions no longer pass through reflection. They manifest directly. Love becomes obsession. Anger becomes annihilation. Pain becomes outward motion. Power without containment removes the distance between feeling and action, and that immediacy is what makes it catastrophic. Xavier's role in Jean's transformation is quietly devastating. His long-held belief in restraint as benevolence is exposed as incomplete. By suppressing Jean's power without her full understanding or consent, he shaped a dependency that left her unprepared to navigate freedom. When the barriers fall, Jean does not experience liberation as growth, but as whiplash. The sudden absence of limits feels less like empowerment and more like abandonment. The trust she placed in Xavier fractures, not because she discovers he is cruel, but because she realizes he decided for her what she could handle. This revelation destabilizes her sense of self more than the power itself. Magneto's response to Jean's emergence reflects his philosophy in its purest form. He does not fear her power, he reveres it. To him, Jean represents the future unbound, proof that restraint is a concession to fear rather than necessity. He offers her validation where Xavier offered caution, framing her power not as a burden but as destiny. Yet even Magneto underestimates the cost of such unfiltered strength. He believes that power naturally aligns with those strong enough to wield it, failing to recognize that strength without integration can devour its source. His encouragement accelerates Jean's detachment from consequence, pushing her further from the person she once was, without offering the grounding she desperately needs. Jean's internal experience is one of profound isolation. Despite being surrounded by allies and ideologues, she stands alone with a force that no one else can truly comprehend. The phoenix does not whisper guidance, it amplifies presence until nothing else can be heard. Memory, responsibility, and empathy fade beneath the intensity of now. This is not corruption, it is overload. The story resists framing Jean as evil, instead portraying her as someone whose capacity has exceeded the frameworks designed to hold it. Her actions are destructive not because she desires harm, but because containment has been replaced with impulse. The consequences of Jean's power ripple outward with irreversible finality. Loss arrives suddenly, without ceremony, emphasizing how quickly excess can erase what restraint once protected. These moments are not treated as spectacles, but as absences that linger, altering the emotional landscape of the story. Jean's inability to stop herself is not presented as moral failure, but as the logical outcome of power divorced from integration. When limits are imposed externally rather than developed internally, their removal creates chaos rather than growth. Jean Grey's arc in The Last Stand becomes a meditation on autonomy and responsibility. Power alone does not grant freedom, understanding does. Containment imposed without consent may prevent immediate harm, but it delays the work of integration that true stability requires. Jean is denied that work, and the cost is catastrophic not only for others, but for herself. The phoenix consumes not because it is malevolent, but because it is unchecked. In the end, Jean's story asks a question that reverberates through the entire X-Men saga. Is it kinder to limit someone for their own good, or to trust them with the risk of becoming too much? The Last Stand offers no comforting answer. It shows only that power without containment is not liberation, it is erosion, stripping away the self until only force remains, and leaving behind a silence where a person once stood. Chapter 11. The War. Mutants against Mutants. The war does not begin with a declaration or a rallying cry, but with a quiet acceptance that lines have already been drawn, and that the distance between ideals has finally become physical, turning belief into action and disagreement into collision. In X-Men, The Last Stand, conflict is no longer framed as mutants versus humans, but as mutants versus mutants, a fracture that reveals how fear, when left unresolved, does not simply disappear but turns inward, forcing those who share the same origin to decide what that origin truly means. The cure, the phoenix, and the growing hostility of the world converge into a moment where neutrality is no longer possible, and every choice carries consequence not only for survival, but for identity. This war is not about conquest, it is about definition. Who gets to decide what it means to be a mutant, and at what cost? Magneto's decision to mobilize is driven less by ambition than by exhaustion. Years of watching fear evolve from whispers to policy have convinced him that restraint has reached its limit. He no longer believes the world can be persuaded, only deterred, and deterrence requires demonstration. His call to arms is framed as protection, yet it demands allegiance that leaves little room for dissent. In Magneto's vision, unity is strength, but unity is enforced through exclusion. Mutants who accept the cure are not merely choosing differently, they are betraying the future. This framing hardens the conflict, transforming personal decisions into ideological transgressions. The war becomes inevitable not because violence is desired, but because compromise has been redefined as surrender. Xavier's absence weighs heavily over the unfolding events. Without his moderating presence, the fragile space where disagreement could coexist collapses. The X-Men are forced into a defensive posture they never sought, compelled to oppose not only Magneto's army, but the logic that fuels it. For them, the war is a tragedy unfolding in slow motion. They recognize the legitimacy of Magneto's fear, while rejecting the certainty of his conclusions. Fighting fellow mutants feels like a failure of the dream they inherited, yet inaction would allow that dream to be replaced by domination. The conflict strips heroism of its clarity, replacing it with necessity. On the battlefield, ideology dissolves into chaos. Powers collide without nuance, each manifestation of mutation becoming both weapon and vulnerability. The visual symmetry of mutants fighting mutants underscores the story's central sorrow. The same gifts that could have redefined coexistence are now being used to enforce division. The war exposes how easily fear reframes difference as threat, even within a community built on shared experience. Brotherhood fractures into factions, and the line between defense and aggression blurs until it is indistinguishable. For individual characters, the war is deeply personal. Choices made under pressure reveal priorities that dialogue never could. Some fight to protect the possibility of choice itself, believing that identity loses meaning when imposed. Others fight to preserve mutation as destiny, fearing that acceptance of the cure will erase not just power, but history. Each position carries its own moral weight, and the film resists simplifying them into right and wrong. Instead, it shows how fear compresses complexity into urgency, forcing decisions that would have seemed unthinkable in quieter times. The presence of the cure on the battlefield amplifies the tragedy. It becomes a literal weapon, capable of stripping mutants of their abilities and, symbolically, of their identity. The act of using it against fellow mutants transforms the war from a clash of beliefs into an erasure of selves. Power is no longer merely opposed, it is removed. This escalation reveals the ultimate danger of the cure. Once identity is framed as optional, it becomes expendable. The battlefield becomes a space where difference is not debated but eliminated. As the conflict reaches its peak, the cost becomes undeniable. Loss arrives without resolution, and victories feel hollow. The war does not produce clarity, it produces aftermath. Survivors are left not with triumph, but with questions that have no immediate answers. What was protected? What was lost? And can a community survive when its greatest enemy becomes internal fracture? The war in The Last Stand is not a conclusion, but a culmination. It shows what happens when fear, ideology, and power collide without mediation. Mutants fight mutants not because they hate one another, but because they have been forced to choose between incompatible futures. In doing so, the saga reveals its most painful truth. The greatest threat to coexistence is not difference itself, but the inability to tolerate different responses to the same fear. When the dust settles, what remains is not victory, but silence and the uneasy realization that some divisions, once made physical, cannot be undone. Chapter 12: Magneto. What remains after the dream fails? When the war ends, it does not conclude with closure or peace, but with quiet devastation, and Magneto stands within that silence as a man who has won nothing, yet lost almost everything, because the failure of the dream is not marked by defeat alone, but by survival stripped of meaning. Eric Laneshere remains, powerful and unbroken in body, yet profoundly altered by what the conflict has taken from him. And what it has confirmed, the world he feared has arrived, not as a sudden apocalypse, but as a series of choices that accumulated until fracture became inevitable. Magneto does not look upon the aftermath with surprise, he looks upon it with recognition. This, to him, is the proof history always promised, and yet proof brings no comfort. The dream did not fail because it was naive. It failed because it could not withstand the weight of fear, given authority and identity treated as optional. Magneto's greatest tragedy is not that he was wrong, but that being right brought no relief. Every loss validates his warnings, while simultaneously deepening the isolation that shaped them. The cure exists, mutants have turned on one another, power has been stripped away, identities rewritten by force and necessity. These outcomes align with his expectations, yet they leave him diminished rather than vindicated. Magneto's ideology was forged to prevent helplessness, but in the end, it cannot protect him from grief. The loss of those closest to him exposes the flaw in a worldview built solely on defense. Protection without connection becomes survival without purpose. In the absence of Charles Xavier, Magneto confronts a void he cannot fill with strength alone. Xavier represented not just opposition, but balance, a reminder that fear could be met with something other than escalation. Their relationship was the last thread tying Magneto to a future that included coexistence, however fragile. With that thread severed, Magneto is left with a world that mirrors his expectations, but lacks the counterweight that gave his resistance meaning. The dream's failure is not just ideological, it is relational. Without Xavier, Magneto has no one left to argue with, and argument was the last space where hope could still exist. Magneto's power, once a symbol of control, becomes ambiguous in the aftermath. Strength remains, but its purpose is unclear. He has spent a lifetime preparing for a world that refuses to accept difference, and now that world stands revealed, leaving him with a question his ideology never addressed. What comes after resistance becomes routine. Survival was always the goal, but survival alone does not answer the need for belonging, or the longing for a future that is more than endurance. Magneto understands better than anyone that fear can shape policy and fracture communities. What he struggles to accept is that fear, once answered with force, rarely recedes. It adapts. The final image of Magneto is not one of conquest or rage, but of restraint, a quiet acknowledgement that power does not guarantee permanence. Even he who bent metal and defied armies is subject to loss, to the erosion of certainty. This moment reframes his entire journey. Magneto was never seeking domination for its own sake. He was seeking a world where children like himself would not be torn from their families, where difference would not be met with violence. That world remains unrealized. The question that lingers is not whether his methods were justified, but whether any method could have succeeded in a system so deeply shaped by fear. What remains after the dream fails is not clarity, but complexity. Magneto is neither redeemed nor condemned. He is left standing in the space between warning and outcome, forced to reckon with the cost of both action and inaction. The saga does not ask us to choose his side or Xavier's. It asks us to recognize the shared origin of their visions, and the shared pain that drove them apart. Magneto's story closes not with resolution, but with reflection, a reminder that survival strategies born from trauma may protect us from repeating the past, but they can also prevent us from imagining a future that looks different from it. In the end, Magneto remains as he began, a man shaped by loss, carrying memory like armor, guarding against a world he knows too well. What changes is not his strength, but the silence around it. The dream of coexistence fades, not because it was foolish, but because it required a level of trust the world was not ready to give. And Magneto, standing in the aftermath, becomes the final witness to that failure, not as a villain, but as a survivor of history repeating itself. What remains after the dream fails is not victory or defeat. It is the unanswered question of whether the dream was ever allowed to truly begin.